I didn't expect retirement to feel this quiet. I had imagined silence as something peaceful, something earned. But that morning, sitting alone at the kitchen table, I realized silence can also feel heavy when it stretches too long. The house wasn't asleep, it was awake with me. And there was nowhere I needed to go. That was the moment I knew something inside me had shifted. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and patient. I watched it for longer than I should have. There was no rush, no pressure, no meeting to get ready for. For the first time in my adult life, time wasn't asking anything from me. I had waited my whole life for this moment, and I wasn't ready. Retirement was supposed to be the reward. That's what everyone said. Years of hard work were meant to end here, in calm mornings and slow days. I believed that story. I worked for it. I counted down the years like they meant something solid. But sitting there with cold coffee and an open day ahead of me, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt unnecessary, not unwanted, not unloved, just not needed. And at my age, that feeling settles deep. I wasn't sad in a dramatic way. I wasn't falling apart. It was quieter than that. A low, steady awareness that something important had ended, and nothing had taken its place. I listened to the sounds of the house, the refrigerator humming, the pipes shifting slightly, and realized how loud silence becomes when you have too much of it. When there's no conversation waiting for you, no role to step into. I thought about how long I had waited to stop working. How many mornings I told myself, one day this will all slow down. Now it had slowed down completely, and instead of relief, I felt exposed. That morning, I didn't tell anyone how I felt. I just sat there, staring at the table, understanding something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. I had waited my whole life to retire, but no one had prepared me for what comes after the waiting ends. Before retirement, my life had a clear shape to it. I didn't think about it much back then because when you're inside a routine, it just feels normal. But now, looking back, I can see how much that structure held me together. For most of my adult life, I woke up early. Not because I enjoyed mornings, but because that's what responsibility demanded. The alarm went off, and I got up. There wasn't much discussion about it. You show up. That's what you do. My days revolved around work. The same drive, the same building, the same faces. There was comfort in that repetition. It gave my life a rhythm, something steady to lean on. Even on bad days, I knew where I belonged. Work wasn't just a job to me. It was proof that I mattered. People depended on me. They trusted me to do things right, to handle problems, to stay steady when things got difficult. I wasn't the loudest man in the room, but I was reliable, and being reliable gave me pride. There's a kind of respect that comes with that. Not applause, not praise, just quiet acknowledgement. Knowing that if you didn't show up, things would be harder for others. That knowledge carries weight. I didn't question my identity back then. I knew who I was because my work told me. I was a provider, a problem solver, someone who carried his share. That sense of purpose followed me home every evening, even when I was tired. Some nights I came home exhausted. My body hurt. My patience was thin. But there was satisfaction in knowing the day had been full, that I had earned my rest. Time moved faster when I was working. Weeks passed without me noticing. Years slipped by quietly. I didn't stop to examine them because I didn't need to. The next task was always waiting. Looking back now, I can see how much of myself was wrapped up in that role, how deeply I tied my worth to being productive. But at the time it felt natural. That's how men of my generation were raised. Work gave my days meaning, but it also gave me direction. It kept my thoughts focused outward instead of inward. I didn't spend much time asking myself big questions about life or identity. There wasn't space for that. When retirement came closer, people told me I'd earned it. They congratulated me, shook my hand, talked about how lucky I was. I believed them. I believed I was ready to step away. What I didn't realize was how much of my sense of self I was leaving behind. I didn't just stop working when I retired. I stepped away from the role that had defined me for decades, and I wouldn't fully understand what that meant until it was gone. For a long time, retirement lived in my mind as a reward, something waiting quietly at the end of all those years of effort. I didn't dream about it every day, but when I did think about it, the picture was always gentle and comforting. I imagined slow mornings, coffee without rushing, no alarm clock telling me who I had to be and when. I thought I would finally breathe without watching the clock. People around me helped build that image. Coworkers talked about retirement like it was a finish line. You'll finally have time for yourself, they said. No stress, no pressure, just enjoy life. I believed them. I thought I would wake up feeling light, free, as if the weight I'd been carrying for decades would simply lift on its own. I believed rest would automatically turn into happiness. In my mind, retirement meant peace. I imagined filling my days easily, reading the newspaper from start to finish, taking longer walks, fixing small things around the house without rushing, maybe traveling once in a while, visiting family more often, doing all the things I told myself I didn't have time for. I assumed I would feel proud of the years I had given, proud of the life I had built. I thought retirement would feel like standing back and admiring finished work. There was also a quiet belief that I wouldn't feel alone. After all, I wasn't disappearing. I was just stepping back. People would still call. Friends would still check in. My presence would still be felt. I didn't expect my importance to fade. I told myself the work was only part of my life, not the whole thing. I believed I had enough outside of it to stay grounded. Family, memories, experience. What I didn't consider was how much work structured my days, my thoughts, even my emotions, how much it guided my sense of direction. I thought freedom would feel warm. Instead, I didn't ask what I would do with it. On my last day of work, people shook my hand and wished me well. There were smiles, kind words, even a small celebration. I smiled back. I thanked them. I felt ready. Walking out that final time, I expected to feel relief. What I felt was strange, not sadness, not fear, just an unfamiliar quiet, like stepping into a room where the furniture had been moved and nothing quite felt where it used to be. At first, I ignored that feeling. I told myself it was just adjustment, that everyone feels this way at the beginning, that peace takes time. I reminded myself that I had planned for this, that I had saved, prepared, waited patiently, that this moment was supposed to be mine. But expectations have a way of sounding louder in your head than reality does. The days ahead didn't look the way I imagined. They weren't full of simple joys or deep rest. They were open in a way I hadn't prepared for. And slowly, quietly, I began to understand that retirement wasn't a destination. It was an unknown space, and I hadn't learned how to live inside it yet. The emptiness didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in small moments that were easy to ignore at first. It started with the mornings. I woke up one day and realized there was no reason to hurry, no schedule waiting for me, no place I needed to be by a certain time. I lay in bed longer than usual, listening to the house breathe around me, the ticking clock, the faint noise of traffic outside, sounds that had always been there, but now felt louder. I told myself this was what I wanted. I made my coffee slowly, sat at the table longer than I used to, watched the steam rise and disappear. There was no rush, and yet there was no comfort either, just time, wide and open. At first I tried to fill it. I read the newspaper, but my attention drifted. I turned on the television, then turned it off again. The programs felt like background noise, not company. I walked around the house, noticing small things I had ignored for years: a scuff on the wall, a loose door handle, old paper stacked in a corner. I fixed a few things, cleaned a few drawers, told myself I was being productive. But by late morning, I began to feel restless. The phone stayed quiet, no calls, no messages, not because people didn't care, but because there was no reason to call anymore. No shared work, no daily problems to solve together, no updates that needed my input. I understood that logically. Emotionally, it felt different. I realized how much of my connection to people had been tied to usefulness, to being needed. Without that, the silence felt heavier. Afternoons stretched longer than I expected. Lunch came and went without meaning. I ate because it was time to eat, not because I felt hungry. Afterward, I sat again, unsure what to do with myself. I started taking walks, mostly to break the stillness. The neighborhood looked the same, but I felt out of place in it. People passed by, heading somewhere. Work, errands, purpose. I was just walking. Sometimes I checked the time, even though I didn't need to. Old habits don't disappear quickly. Evenings were worse. As the sun went down, the house grew quieter. Shadows stretched across the rooms. I noticed how empty the space felt without conversation or plans. Dinner tasted bland, eaten alone more often than not. The phone still didn't ring. I began to realize that work had not only filled my days, it had filled the spaces between them. Without it, there were gaps I didn't know how to close. I told myself this phase would pass, that this was just the beginning, that I needed to give myself time to adjust. But deep down, something felt off. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. I wasn't falling apart. I was simply untethered. Like something important had been removed, and I hadn't noticed how much it mattered until it was gone. Nights became longer. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind wandered to places it never had time to visit before, questions I had avoided, thoughts I had postponed. Lying in the dark, I felt the weight of the day settle in my chest. Not pain, not panic, just a quiet heaviness. That's when I understood. Retirement hadn't taken my work, it had taken my structure. And without it, the emptiness had room to grow. The realization didn't come on a bad day. That's what surprised me the most. There was no argument, no illness, no sudden loss that triggered it. It came on an ordinary afternoon, one that looked exactly like the day before. Quiet, uneventful, forgettable. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee I had already finished. The light from the window fell across the table in a way I'd seen 1,000 times before, but this time I noticed it linger. Nothing was pulling me away from that moment. No calls, no deadlines, no reason to move. That's when it hit me. I wasn't needed anymore, not in the way I had been for most of my life. For decades, people depended on me. At work, my opinion mattered. My decisions carried weight. Problems landed on my desk because I was trusted to solve them. Even when it was stressful, even when it drained me, it gave me something solid to stand on. Now there was nothing waiting for my input. The world wasn't broken without me. It was functioning just fine. That truth settled slowly, like dust in a room that hasn't been disturbed. I thought about my old workplace. How new people had filled the chair I once sat in. How meetings continued without my voice. How systems I helped build now ran without me being part of them. At first, I told myself this was natural. Of course life moves on. Of course, companies replace people. I had said the same things to others when they retired before me, but knowing something and feeling it are two different things. I realized that for years my sense of worth had been closely tied to being useful to others, not in a needy way, just quietly, subtly. I didn't demand appreciation. I didn't crave praise. I simply liked knowing that my presence made a difference somewhere. Now my days left no marks. If I stayed in bed longer, nothing changed. If I skipped a walk, nothing fell apart. If I didn't speak all day, the world stayed exactly the same. That scared me more than I expected. I began to see how invisible I had become. Not ignored, not dismissed, just unnecessary. Family checked in, of course. They cared. But they have their own lives, their own routines, their own responsibilities. I was no longer woven into their daily rhythm the way work once wove me into other people's lives. I wasn't the man people needed answers from anymore. I was just a retired man filling time. That afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway, looking at an old coat I used to wear to work. It still hung there out of habit. I touched the fabric, feeling something tighten in my chest. That coat had carried me through years of purpose. Now, it was just clothing. I thought about how often I used to complain about work. The long hours, the pressure, the stress. I remembered wishing for the day I could finally stop. And yet, here I was, missing something I once rushed through. Not the job itself, but the feeling of mattering. The realization followed me into the evening. I felt it while eating dinner alone, while washing the dishes slowly, while sitting in the living room with the lights low and the television on mute. I had crossed into a stage of life where no one was waiting for me to show up. That didn't make me worthless, but it did change how I saw myself. I understood then that retirement hadn't just ended my career, it had ended a version of me, a version that knew exactly where he fit in the world. And the hardest part wasn't losing work. It was losing the certainty of who I was without it. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt a quiet grief settle in. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just steady. I had prepared financially for retirement. I had planned responsibly. I had checked every practical box. But I had never prepared for this moment. The moment when I realized that being free didn't mean being fulfilled, that having time didn't mean having purpose, that stopping didn't mean resting, it meant starting over. And I wasn't sure how to do that anymore. Once that realization settled in, the day started to feel heavier. Not dramatic, not crushing, just heavier. Like every morning required a little more effort than the one before. I would wake up early, out of habit, the same way I had for decades. My body didn't know I was retired. It still followed the old schedule. I'd lie there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar sense of urgency to arrive. It never did. Instead, there was a quiet question waiting for me. What now? I'd get out of bed slowly, not because I was tired, but because there was no reason to rush. I'd make coffee and stand in the kitchen, mug warming my hands, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. No radio, no morning news. Just the sound of the house being alive without asking anything from me. Some days I tried to keep myself busy. I made lists, small ones, clean the garage, sort old papers, take a longer walk, fix things that didn't really need fixing. But the truth is, I wasn't doing these things because they needed to be done. I was doing them so the day wouldn't feel so empty. Time moved differently now. Hours stretched. Afternoons felt endless. Without meetings or deadlines, the day had no shape. I'd look at the clock and feel surprised by how little time had passed. Other days, the opposite happened. I'd sit down, lost in my thoughts, and suddenly, the sun was setting. I couldn't always explain where the time went. It just slipped past me. The evenings were the hardest. During my working years, evenings felt earned. They were a release, a chance to slow down after a full day. Now, evenings arrived without effort, without meaning. They didn't feel like rest. They felt like reminders. I'd sit on the couch with the television on, not really watching. I wasn't bored exactly. I was distracted from my own thoughts. That became a pattern. Noise without engagement. Company without connection. Some nights I went to bed earlier than usual, hoping sleep would come quickly. It often didn't. My mind would replay moments from the day not because anything happened, but because nothing did. I'd think about conversations I hadn't had, calls that never came, invitations that were no longer extended. I didn't blame anyone. People were busy. Life moved forward. I was the one who had slowed down. There were moments when I felt a quiet frustration rise up, not anger, just a dull sense of being stuck. I wanted to feel useful again, but I didn't know how to fit myself into a world that no longer needed me the way it once had. Some days I avoided mirrors. Aging felt louder in stillness. Every ache, every stiff joint, every reminder of time passing seemed more noticeable when my days were empty. When I worked, I barely paid attention to those things. There was always something else demanding my focus. Now there was space to notice everything, including the loneliness. It wasn't constant. That surprised me too. It came in waves. I could feel fine one moment, even peaceful, and then suddenly feel a heaviness settle in my chest for no clear reason. I missed being expected somewhere. I missed being part of a system bigger than myself. I missed being the man people counted on without thinking twice. Some afternoons, I'd step outside just to see other people moving through their day. Neighbors heading to work, parents walking with kids, delivery trucks stopping and starting. Everyone had somewhere to go. I went back inside. There were days I felt guilty for feeling this way. I reminded myself that I was fortunate. I had a home. My health was mostly intact. Many people never get the chance to retire at all, but guilt didn't erase the emptiness. It just added another layer to it. The emotional struggle wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It lived in the background, steady and persistent. Like a low hum you can't quite tune out, I learned that retirement doesn't always arrive with freedom. Sometimes it arrives with silence, and learning how to live inside that silence was harder than any job I ever worked. With so much quiet around me, the past started to speak louder. I didn't go looking for it. It came on its own, in small moments, while folding old clothes, while opening drawers I hadn't touched in years, while finding papers that no longer mattered but somehow felt important just because they were old. Retirement gave me time, too much of it. And time has a way of pulling memories to the surface. I began thinking about the man I was when I was younger, not just at work, but at home. I thought about how often I said I'd get to things later. Later when the project was finished. Later when things slowed down. Later when retirement came. Later arrived, and some things never did. I thought about missed dinners, not because I didn't care, but because I was tired, because I told myself providing for my family was enough, because I believed there would always be more time. I see now how easy it is to confuse responsibility with presence. I was there, but not always available. I was in the room, but often somewhere else in my head, thinking about work, planning the next day, carrying stress home without realizing it. At the time, it felt unavoidable, necessary, normal. Looking back, I wonder how many moments slipped past me quietly while I was busy doing what I thought I had to do. I don't beat myself up over it, not anymore. Regret doesn't help much at my age. But reflection does. Reflection shows me patterns. It shows me what I valued, even when I didn't say it out loud. I valued being reliable, being strong, being the one who didn't complain. But I didn't always value slowing down. I didn't always value asking myself what I needed. There were faces I wish I had looked at longer, conversations I wish I had stayed in instead of cutting short, evenings I wish I had protected instead of sacrificing. At the time, I thought I was building something solid, and in many ways I was. But I didn't realize that while I was building a career, I was also trading pieces of time I could never get back. Now, in retirement, those trades feel heavier. I also reflected on how much of my identity I handed over to my job. I didn't do it intentionally. It just happened over years of routine, over years of being known as the guy who handles things. When that label disappeared, I didn't know what replaced it. I asked myself questions I had avoided for decades. Who am I when I'm not working? What do I contribute now? What parts of me did I ignore because they didn't fit into my schedule? Some answers were uncomfortable. I realized how rarely I checked in with myself emotionally, how often I pushed through exhaustion without asking why I felt so drained, how easily I accepted stress as the price of being useful. I don't regret working hard. I don't regret providing. I don't regret taking responsibility seriously. But I do regret believing that life would somehow pause and wait for me to catch up later. It doesn't. Life keeps moving quietly, whether you're paying attention or not. I also thought about friendships. How many faded without conflict? Just distance. How work once gave me built-in social circles that disappeared the moment I retired. I didn't realize how much effort it takes to maintain connection when there's no shared structure holding people together. That realization didn't make me sad. It made me honest. Honest about what I took for granted. Honest about what I neglected. And honest about what still mattered to me now. Reflection doesn't change the past. but it softens it. It helps me see my younger self with understanding instead of judgment. I was doing the best I knew how, with what I understood at the time. That has to be enough. Now, the question isn't what I should have done differently. The question is what I do with what's left. After all that reflection, I couldn't sit still anymore. Not physically, emotionally. There came a point when the quiet stopped feeling thoughtful and started feeling heavy. I knew I couldn't spend the rest of my retirement just looking backward. I didn't need a grand mission or a dramatic reinvention, but I needed something that gave my days a reason to stand up straight. So I started looking for purpose. Not the kind people talk about in speeches, not passion or legacy. Just something simple, something that made me feel like the day had weight. At first, I tried filling my time the way people suggested. Hobbies, classes, activities. I signed up for a few things out of habit more than interest. Some of them stuck for a while, most didn't. It turns out purpose isn't something you pick off a shelf. I tried volunteering. The idea felt right. Helping others seemed like a good way to feel useful again, and in some ways it was. I showed up. I did what was asked. People appreciated the help. But even there, I felt a quiet distance. I was useful, yes, but replaceable. If I didn't show up one day, someone else would. That wasn't a bad thing. It just wasn't the answer I was looking for. I realized I wasn't searching for importance. I was searching for connection. I missed being involved, being known, being part of something where my presence wasn't just helpful but familiar. So I turned inward instead. I started paying attention to how I spent my time, which parts of the day felt lighter, which moments didn't feel forced. I noticed that purpose didn't show up when I was busy. It showed up when I was engaged. Some mornings, that meant sitting with a book longer than usual. Not rushing through pages, but staying with a thought, letting it settle. Other days, it meant walking the same route and noticing different things. The way the light changed, the way my body moved slower but steadier. I started calling people instead of waiting for calls that might not come. Short conversations. No big updates, just checking in. Some calls led nowhere. Others reminded me the connection doesn't disappear, it just needs effort. That surprised me. I had spent years letting work structure my relationships. When work ended, so did that structure. I had assumed connection would follow me into retirement automatically. It doesn't. You have to rebuild it. Carefully, without forcing it. I also began writing things down. Not for anyone else, just for myself. Thoughts, observations, small moments that felt honest. I didn't call it journaling. That word felt too heavy. I thought of it as leaving myself notes. That practice did something unexpected. It gave shape to my days. When I wrote, I wasn't killing time. I was paying attention. I was present, and presence, I learned, is often the beginning of purpose. Purpose didn't arrive as a sudden answer. It crept in quietly. It showed up when I allowed myself to be slower without feeling useless, when I stopped measuring my worth by productivity, when I accepted that contribution looks different at this stage of life. Some days, purpose was as small as listening carefully to someone else's story. Other days, it was simply taking care of my space, my health, my mind. I stopped asking, what should I be doing? I started asking, what feels honest today? That shift didn't fix everything. I still had empty moments. I still had quiet days that stretched longer than I wanted. But those days didn't scare me as much anymore. I was no longer waiting for purpose to arrive fully formed. I was letting it build, piece by piece, in the spaces I used to ignore. And for the first time since retiring, I felt something steady underneath the silence. Not excitement, not ambition, just a quiet sense that my days could still hold meaning, even if they looked nothing like they used to. Acceptance didn't arrive all at once. It didn't come as relief or clarity or some sudden sense of peace. It came quietly, in pieces, spread out over time. Small moments where I stopped fighting what my days had become and started letting them be what they were. For a long time, I had been measuring my retirement against the life I used to have. Every quiet morning felt like a failure. Every slow afternoon felt like proof that something was missing. I kept comparing the man I was to the man I thought I should still be. That comparison wore me down. Eventually, I realized I was exhausting myself by resisting a reality that wasn't going anywhere. I was older. I was retired. My life no longer moved at the speed it once did. Once I stopped arguing with those facts, something shifted. I began to notice that silence itself wasn't the enemy. My reaction to it was, I'd been treating quiet like a problem to solve instead of a condition to live within. When I stopped trying to fill every empty space, the silence softened. Some mornings, I'd sit with my coffee and not rush to do anything. No list, no plan, just sitting. At first, that made me uncomfortable. It felt unproductive, almost wrong. But over time, it started to feel honest. I listened more. To sounds I used to tune out, the ticking clock, the distant traffic, birds in the early hours. These sounds didn't demand anything from me. They just existed. So did I. I also began to accept my limitations. My body didn't recover the way it used to. My energy came and went. I needed more rest, less noise, fewer commitments. That used to frustrate me. Now I see it as information, not weakness. Aging isn't something you defeat. You learn how to move with it. You adjust. You stop proving things. You stop pushing just to feel relevant. I had spent years being defined by output, results, performance. Acceptance meant letting go of that measuring stick. I wasn't behind. I wasn't failing. I was simply in a different season. Emotionally, that understanding brought relief. Not happiness exactly, but steadiness. I didn't wake up every day wondering what was wrong with me. I stopped labeling my quieter moods as problems that needed fixing. Some days were light, some were heavy. Both were allowed. I also accepted that loneliness didn't mean I was broken. It meant I was human. It meant I'd cared deeply about connection, structure, and purpose. Feeling the absence of those things didn't make me weak. It made me honest. I learned to sit with uncomfortable emotions without rushing past them. When sadness showed up, I didn't panic. I didn't distract myself immediately. I let it be present, knowing it would pass. And it usually did. Acceptance didn't erase regret, but it gave it less power. It didn't remove emptiness, but it made it less sharp. It didn't give me back my old identity, but it helped me loosen my grip on it. I wasn't the man I used to be, and that was okay. There was dignity in aging, even when it felt uncertain. There was meaning in slowing down, even when it felt unfamiliar. There was value in simply being without needing to justify my existence through usefulness. That understanding didn't come from thinking harder. It came from letting go. And in that letting go, I found a quieter kind of strength, one that didn't need recognition, schedules, or approval to exist. If there's one thing I've learned over these years of retirement, it's that no one really prepares you for the quiet that comes after work stops. Not the financial quiet, which you can plan for, but the emotional quiet, the one that makes you question your value, your purpose, and even your identity. I've spent a long time thinking about what I wish someone had told me. What I wish I'd understood before stepping out of the office for the last time. Maybe it can help someone else, younger or older, who is heading into this part of life. First, your sense of purpose doesn't have to disappear when your job does. You might feel lost at first. That's natural. It's okay to feel unneeded or invisible. It doesn't mean you're not important. It just means you're in a new chapter where the roles you once played don't define you anymore. Second, slow down, but don't stop noticing life. The little details you once ignored become your companions when you retire. The sunlight on the floor, the sound of wind in the trees, the quiet voice of memory. Learning to pay attention to them can be surprisingly grounding. Third, connection matters more than ever. Don't wait for others to reach out. Call someone. Share a story. Even small moments of engagement remind you that you're still part of the world, even when the world isn't demanding anything from you. Fourth, allow yourself to feel. Accept the loneliness, the sadness, the uncertainty, without judgment. Retirement, doesn't erase emotions, it just gives you the time to meet them. And meeting them honestly is part of learning how to live again. Finally, be patient with yourself. You can't replace a lifetime of work overnight. You won't find purpose in a single activity. It builds slowly, quietly, in the spaces you allow yourself to notice, to connect, and to care. If I could give my younger self advice, it would be this. Start practicing these things before retirement. Notice what gives you meaning. Notice who matters to you, and understand that your worth isn't tied to your productivity. It never really was. It's tied to your presence, your care, your attention. Retirement can feel like an ending, but if you approach it with honesty, patience, and gentle awareness, it can also be a beginning. A beginning where you still matter, not in the same ways you once did, but in ways that are quieter, slower, and deeper. I can't promise it will be easy. Some days the emptiness will feel heavier than others. But with time, acceptance, and connection, the weight softens. You start to realize that life continues to have meaning, even when your old structure is gone. And that's something worth holding on to. Now, after all these years, I can sit quietly and feel a kind of peace I didn't expect. Not the loud, triumphant peace I imagined when I dreamed about retirement, but a softer, steadier one. It comes in small moments: a cup of coffee in the morning, the sun moving slowly across the kitchen floor, the hum of the refrigerator in the evening. I've learned that life doesn't stop when your work does. It continues. It changes. And you change with it whether you like it or not. I've stopped trying to fight that. Instead, I watch it quietly, noticing the details that used to pass me by. I accept that my days are slower now. I accept that I won't feel needed the way I once did. I accept that I have limits, that my energy is different, and that some moments of loneliness are simply part of living. That doesn't make them easier, but it makes them real. Honest. Something I can sit with instead of running from. In this slower life, I've found ways to care for myself, ways to care for others, ways to notice what matters. It's not glamorous, it's not heroic, but it is enough. It is steady, and it is mine. I've also learned to forgive myself. For moments I rushed through, for the time I didn't give, for the pieces of life I ignored while chasing schedules and deadlines. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just lets me live more fully in the present. I no longer fear silence. I no longer measure my value by productivity. I simply exist, and that alone has meaning. I wake up, I breathe, I move, and in those small actions, I find dignity. Retirement isn't a finish line. It isn't a reward. It's a different chapter, one that requires patience, understanding, and self-compassion. And when you finally allow yourself to accept it, you find that life still has depth, still has warmth, still has small moments of joy, even in quiet. I'm not the man I was before retirement. That man has moved on. But I am still here, still noticing, still feeling, still learning. And that is enough. Even in quiet, I am present. Even in stillness, I am living. And perhaps that is the most peaceful realization of all. If you've listened this far, I want to ask you something, not as advice, not as a lecture, but as a question from one person to another. Have you ever paused to notice what really matters in your day? Even in the quiet moments, the ones that seem small or empty, there is something to be seen, something to be felt. Sometimes it's connection, sometimes it's memory, sometimes it's simply being present. I know retirement, aging, and quiet days can feel heavy, even lonely. But I've learned that sharing our thoughts, even quietly with ourselves or with others, makes the weight a little lighter. It reminds us that we're still here. We still matter, even if our world looks different than it used to. If my story resonates with you, or if you found a moment of understanding in these words, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe quietly, without pressure, just so you can continue hearing stories like mine. Stories that remind us life has depth, even in silence. And maybe, when your day feels slow or your world feels smaller, you can remember there is still meaning, still presence, still dignity in just being. and sometimes that is enough. Thank you for letting me share my journey with you.